Do-do-do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do-do.
Who are you gonna call?
Hi, this is Mort's Mortuary, home of Mort's best morgues, where your morgue is our masterpiece. And don't worry, we're not letting Bob around the bodies anymore.
And welcome back, Corkies, to this very special episode of Crips and Corks. I'm your host, DJ, here with my ever lovely co-host.
Paul, as usual. And you
I
guys,
really thought you were gonna say Mort or Bob, and I don't know which would have concerned me more.
it's fine. But if you're watching our video, you might have noticed that we have guests, and DJ's not in our usual podcast area. And that's because DJ said he would rather die than be in the same room as me anymore.
Don't lie, it's because I have COVID.
Oh my
JK.
gosh.
Are
No,
we
he
allowed
doesn't
to
know
have we
this.
gotten to a point in history where we can joke about that yet?
I'm not sure. But why don't we ask our special guest? Let's get into our special guest because, again, if you're watching our video, we have very special guests. This is a very special episode. It is our Lockhouse number 25, Poolsville Investigation Expansion episode. And if you've already seen the YouTube video, you know we did that investigation with two very awesome people. So first, I want to introduce Lennon first. So Lennon, why don't you introduce yourself first, and then we'll do Cam. And then, yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself, Lennon. Yeah, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what organizations you're with and things.
Thanks for that, Paul. So my name is Lennon Gross, and I am one of the co-authors of the Mysteries and Legends of the Agricultural Reserve program, which is based out of the Agricultural Reserve in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is where Poolsville sits. So I was actually born and raised in Poolsville, Maryland. I have since moved out closer to the district, but it still holds a large sway on my heart specifically because of all of the fascinating history and untold stories. There is a lot of lore and legend that comes out of Poolsville, Maryland. And I think that it's just a phenomenally interesting place to investigate, which is exactly what we did.
Right. It was, and I definitely learned that while we were investigating. I learned so much history. I had no clue what happened, but we will definitely get into the history a little bit later. Cam, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Um, I make ghost hunting gear.
You make very high quality ghost hunting gear, and you actually have your own company, right?
Yeah, theprojectpara.com.
Projectpara.com, and people can purchase all your ghost hunting stuff.
Yes.
And we did have the privilege of using some of your ghost hunting equipment on the investigation of the Lockhouse number 25, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I will say it's some very high quality stuff, and Cam really knows what he's talking about.
Thank you.
Anytime, anytime. Now, DJ, do you want to get into the beverages?
Hi, my name's DJ. I'm an alcoholic. I am drinking a Swifty as usual.
A
It,
Swifty. Okay.
yes, for you ignorant sluts who don't know out there, it is Taylor Swift's favorite drink, and it is vodka and Diet Coke with ice.
I thought it was just like the initiation ritual. Like you can't be a true follower of Taylor Swift until you consume the vital fluids of the follower above you, right?
Oh no.
I mean, if it was a cult, I mean, the cult branch of Swiftyism, yes, but I belong to the Reformed Church of Swiftism.
Of course, of course.
Formed.
We
Oh,
don't drink people anymore.
No, no, not anymore. We just like wait for the sweat of Taylor to trickle down to us.
you licked the stage after the Eras
Holistically.
tour.
Um, if I did not have a fear of feet, I maybe.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, Cam, what are you drinking over there?
Alani New, space flavor.
Ooh.
What is that? Is that an energy drink? Is there like,
Yeah.
okay, that's wild. See, caffeine makes me anxious. I can't do caffeine anymore. I can't even drink coffee.
And
No.
Lennon, what are you drinking?
I am drinking Haunted Chalky Melt, which is
Ooh.
my take on a mudslide. I was introduced to this beverage in the Banshees Labyrinth, which is the most haunted bar in Edinburgh, Scotland. And I promptly renamed whatever the actual drink name was to Haunted Chalky Milk. So that's what we're drinking tonight.
Yes, reclaim it. And
Wait,
Paul,
hold up. Before we get to meat, what's in this haunted chalky milk again? What's going on?
drop the
I'm so
recipe.
glad you asked, Paul. So it's oat milk because my tummy is sad.
Mhm.
It's also so I am not the biggest fan of like chocolate syrup, so I made this with like the powdered dark chocolate, and
Ooh,
then instead of like regular sugar, I used like a coffee vanilla syrup. And then after that, I poured in Kahlua and vodka until my ancestors told me to stop. So,
And that's how you got to do it. You pour with your heart.
Concha Chalky Milk.
yes. And it kind of reminds me of a chocolate version of mine and Paul's favorite creepy cocktail, the White Russian from Dyatlov Pass.
If y'all, if y'all
That's
haven't had a
very good.
girl, get into the White Russian. It is so good and it is so strong. It'll get you where you need to be in one drink. It's
And the
Yeah.
crazy.
Blue Russian, the Frostbite Russian. I need to stop.
Especially because I took my own, not to like totally veer, but we're talking about alcohol. I took like several different White Russian recipes and was like, what's the booziest thing I could do? So some said like, okay, you do Kahlua, vodka, and cream. Some people said you do Kahlua or you do Kahlua and Bailey's. I said, let's do all three and just make it an alcoholic's wet dream.
Oh, that sounds crazy. That sounds like you're about to make some bad decisions after that one.
Oh, you have watched me make this and you have since made several for yourself.
Go kiss a ghost or something.
It's so strong I forgot. Whoops.
Oh God. Paul, what you drinking over there?
So mine is a little different. So mine is actually the Smirnoff, red, white, and berry. It tastes like a blue popsicle, and it is probably the best hard seltzer I've had. It is so good. Minus like the patriotism and everything. It's super good.
I have a question.
What?
What does blue taste like?
Blue raspberry. It tastes like blue raspberry. What do you
Just
mean?
the way you said blue popsicle was like, okay, so what's blue taste like? I'll shut up and stop embarrassing myself.
No, you're fine. No,
Um,
blue raspberry is the best flavor, honestly.
shall we cheers?
I love it.
Cheers. Crips and corks and
L'chaim.
L'chaim.
period. All right. So why don't we get into so we went to Lock House number 25 in Poolsville, Maryland, and there going in, I didn't think there was as much haunted history as I found out there was. I did not realize because this lock house isn't one of like the main haunted houses you see on the internet. It's not like the Conjuring house or like a penitentiary or anything. So I wasn't too sure what to expect going in, but we got educated real quick walking into that house. As soon as we walked in, Lennon was like, actually, this is probably the most haunted place in Maryland. Let me educate you. Now, can you give us a brief breakdown of the haunted history of the Lock House? Because you're the resident expert right now.
Absolutely. I certainly wouldn't give it the title of the most haunted place in Maryland, but it is incredibly haunted. So the Lock House, and if you're not familiar with what a Lock House is, it's essentially a house that would have been manned by the Lockman and his family. And essentially what that means is that at all hours of the night, they could be called upon in order to wake up, get moving, and open the lock, which was a channel on the C&O Canal, which would fill and allow a ship barge to pass from one section of the canal to the next. So being a lockman or like a person of the lock was a job. And it was almost like a government assigned position because the locks were government housing that were provided along the C&O Canal. There's something like 74, I want to say, is the number of locks that exist along Maryland, specifically in the C&O Canal. Um, it might be the entire C&O Canal. I'll get that exact figure for you. There's 74 something. Um, but that being said, so the lock houses, they are essentially a living quarter for the lockman and his family. Sometimes there would be whole families living there, but the actual history of the lock is a little bit difficult to ascertain as well, because a lockman might be living there for a period of time and then all at once might just abandon their post. And if that were to happen, then the lock committee might just appoint another person to come in and basically take up the charge of being a lockman. And why was this so important? Well, you see, in the early days of transatlantic shipping and basically transcontinental shipping, um, ships would come in through Annapolis or they would come in through the Baltimore port, and you needed this sort of exchange of resources. And so the canal system was the way to take the shipping containers basically up the East Coast. And so the canals went all the way, of course, to Ohio. That's why it's the C&O Canal. But at the same time, the system would bring shipping goods up to Annapolis, up to Washington, D.C., and it's all along, of course, the Potomac River. So, that being said, the reason that the individual lock house is so, I guess, haunted is because it sits at an intersection of history that is really interesting. So, when you talk about things like the Civil War, when you talk about things like Native American presence, sometimes these can come across as just abstract historical concepts, but in Poolesville, Maryland, they are very much the history of the town. So Maryland is crisscrossed with what you would call Civil War trails, and those are essentially historically relevant trail markings across the Civil War battlegrounds. And this was a very important place for both the Union and the Confederate armies, not only because the Battle of Ball's Bluff happened just a couple of miles down the river, but also because I completely lost my train of thought. Hold on, ADHD
You're
moment.
fine. It happens to me all the time. Side note, don't they call that the haunted house bend actually where the lock house is?
They do call that the Haunted House Bend. The funniest thing about the Haunted House Bend legend is that there's never been a house there, and it's never been a haunted house. But the reason that Haunted House Bend is called that is because historically horses have spooked. We have also accounts of in the woods that area training dogs who will go on to be part of search and rescue operations, spooking in the woods for absolutely no reason. In and around that area, where Haunted House Bend turns into Mickey Becher's, which is a wildlife preserve. So basically where the C&O Canal meets the rest of the agricultural reserve area. Um, we have also heard sightings of people who have been walking along the C&O Canal Trail, which is essentially the trail that goes right along that C&O Canal, who have reported seeing a figure behind them or in front of them or passing another figure on that haunted house bend, only to turn around and see it. There's nobody there. Other people have reported seeing soldiers encamped in the woods, as the Union would have made prolific use of encampments all across this area of Maryland leading up to the Potomac. But at Edwards Ferry specifically, it wasn't just the Union that would make encampments right there by the river, but it was also communities of freed Black settlers and their communities that would have popped up around the ferries as workhouses. There's also in this area of Maryland a very unfortunate history of slavery. In fact, during the Civil War, when Maryland was sort of questioning where they stood on abolition, The rest of Maryland was rather agnostic as to whether uphold or to abolish slavery as an institution. Um, but the agricultural reserve depended so heavily on enslaved labor that they raised quite the fuss, and almost all of the opposition was coming from this end of the state. And so you get some very sordid and upsetting accounts from the agricultural reserve when it comes to how enslaved people were treated. In fact, there's even a character from the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, Uncle Tom's Cabin that was reportedly based on an overseer from Poolsville. So that gives you just any insight into the historical context.
Wow. And when you were going to bring up the Battle of the Bluff, is that what it's called? Bull's Bluff? Were you going to talk
The
about
Battle of Ball's Bluff.
Bull's Bluff? Okay. Were you going to talk about the soldiers floating down the river?
Oh, absolutely, I can. So the Battle of Ball's Bluff was a horrible defeat for the Union Army during the Civil War. And essentially, what happened was that they were relatively even matched in number, the Confederates and the Union, but several mistakes were made, incorrect calls were made throughout the battle. And in fact, the only active senator, which was Colonel Baker, was killed in that battle. And it was his death that essentially broke down any semblance of unity on the Union side, which led to the scramble down the hill. Because the way that the battle essentially took place is on the two sides of the Potomac. And the way that the Union was essentially crossing the Potomac was by way of the ferries that existed from Maryland to Virginia, Virginia to Maryland. That's why this was sort of a pocket of Confederate sympathizing within, again, a generally agnostic state. And the reason for that was because there was so much migration from Virginia into Maryland. And of course, Virginia was the seat of the Confederacy. So you have the ferries where people are moving back and forth constantly, and the Union set up outposts, most famously at White's Ferry, which was the longest running ferry across the Potomac River and just closed down a few years ago. But in my childhood, we took White's Ferry across the river to go to Virginia.
Mhm.
The Battle of Ball's Bluff, it happened in 1861. It was a very cold October day, and the embankment that led up to the battleground is what gave the Confederacy essentially the high ground. It was very much a I have the high ground, Anakin moment, but it essentially allowed the Confederacy to sharpshoot on the Union from their advantageous position and force them to retreat back to Harrison Island. And Harrison Island is the landmass in the center of the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia, and is where many of the retreating Union soldiers clung throughout the night. There are reports from soldiers who were hunkered down that very cold October night. It was raining, it was storming, there was mudslides, it was horrific. So there are reports that some of the soldiers decided that they were going to make the treacherous escape to Maryland. And one of the things you have to understand about the Potomac River is that the current is deceptively strong, and the bottom of the river is also pitted, which means that at any moment there could be an undertow and it could pull you under and you could get trapped there. So there are accounts of soldiers who had leapt from Harrison Island to attempt to flee to Maryland, only to hear them desperately splashing for their lives. Then the Confederate gunshot would go off. You'd hear maybe one or two more strokes, and then it would go quiet again. They said that bodies washed up all along the river, including Edwards Ferry and even as far down as Washington, D.C. And a local Confederate sympathizing paper even said that all the fish in the river would taste like dead Yankees for weeks.
That's crazy. Now, one more point of the history I want to touch on is before the Civil War, before the colonists even got there, there were Native Americans in that area, correct?
Correct. So Most principally that we're aware of at the point of colonial contact was the Piscataway tribe. And the Piscataway tribe is sort of an offshoot of the more northern Lenape, as well as the overarching Nanticoke. Not to say that they're the same tribe because that is not true, but they did share a language structure. So the Piscataway Native Americans did live here, and even Great Falls, which has known petroglyphs. And a petroglyph is a grafting into stone that is essentially drawn on by grinding down with other stone or made tools to create a picture. So we see petroglyphs at a couple significant places in Maryland, notably the Conowingo Dam, which is much farther north and also was, so it's bald friar rock that was destroyed with the creation of the Conowingo Dam. But another place that we see them is at Great Falls. So we know that this was a very significant area for the Native Americans. And we know that other tribes that might have been in the area were the Iroquois as well. Great Falls, in their timeline of history, has all of two entries relating to Native Americans. And the first is pre-contact, where they talk about Great Falls being a very important trading hub. Sorry about the lights flickering, it's spooky.
That was
They talk about
that
Great
was like
Falls. No, it's actually just terrible wiring in my 1950s home. So
so
there's
fire
nothing more
hazard
scary than
spooky.
aluminum wiring, kids.
Fire hazard spooky.
Maybe lead pipes
Maybe lead pipes, perhaps, actually.
or
Uh,
arsenic paper.
Dials. Where are my radium girls at? Watch dials, the like neon fluorescent
Yeah.
green.
Mhm.
Um, Great Falls, the national park, does basically identify Great Falls as a very important site for the Native American people and multiple tribes. So not just the Piscataway, but those are the ones that we are most recently aware of. And we know that there were several villages along this stretch of the Potomac and possibly ossuaries as well. An ossuary is in this area of the United States, usually a shallow grave pit that is dug above the river on higher ground to look over it. And this would have held the bodies of generations worth of people when they passed away. And so we very much do inhabit native land, but after 1700, the record of Native American people in this area goes very quiet. And in fact, according to Great Falls website, after 1700 is the number right there. It basically says that Native Americans disappeared from this area. Now, the reasons as to why are up to speculation, and there are some circumstantial historical records that might point to violence against these tribes. And I, for one, am inclined to agree with that circumstantial evidence. However, we weren't there, we can't know for sure, and so I won't report it as fact.
Right. So we got a whole lot of things going on this land that could potentially make it haunted. We have potential Native American spirits, Civil War spirits, lockhouse people who ran the lockhouse. Like, there's a lot of potential, like not just from the house being haunted, but the land around it. And just real quick before we move on from the history, can they learn more about history somewhere? Let's say maybe your book? Shout out the name one more time for the people.
Thank you so much. So my wonderful co-author, Christine Hubbard, and I are writing a book together, and that is Medley Mysteries, Curious Tales and Hidden Histories of Montgomery County's Agricultural Reserve. And it is essentially exactly what we're doing here, which is the history of the Agricultural Reserve through the lens of ghost stories, but as well as like other legends. Really quick one, we have an NIH farm in Poolsville, and all of the barbed wire is pointed in. like they're trying to keep something in rather than they're trying to keep you out.
It's very
So
melon heads.
interesting.
What's NaH?
That is the National Institute of Health. So they
Ooh.
do testing, and specifically on this farm, animal testing. It is known as their monkey lab, which is how we get reports of hybrid monkey creatures roaming the woods in Poolsville. So it's basically like our mini Sasquatch.
Oh my gosh. Next investigation. We're there, girl. I'm ready.
We're out there. We're out there
Yeah,
with our little flashlights and beef jerky going like, where's our tiny squatches at?
exactly. We're jumping the barbed wire. We're there.
I don't know about all of that, but now that we've covered some of the history, why don't we discuss a little bit about our first initial walkthrough and some of our first impressions upon entering the lock house?
Yeah, Cam, you were there for a little bit before we got there by yourself. What was that like?
I didn't want to go upstairs or downstairs.
Dude.
What was there like a feeling or like what? Why didn't you want to go?
It was just creepy, and there were a lot of spiders.
There were a lot of spiders. That
Yes.
place was. Go ahead. Oh, I was gonna say that place was dirty. Yeah,
It wasn't dirty. It is a natural habitat for arachnids and insects. And that's just how houses in that era were. And they are all vital parts of our ecosystem, all except centipedes, which are Satan's children. And I wish them to crawl back through the portals to hell that they crawled out of.
that was such
I
a
was just gonna say, we're just lucky we didn't find a poisonous snake, right?
right because we were
I'm
out in nature.
I
We
am
were in the
so
woods
glad.
woods.
I am
Yeah,
so glad in the comfort of my nice, clean, air conditioned, and electrified home with indoor plumbing that we discuss the stakes now, because if that had come up beforehand, your boy probably would have stayed home.
There are some things, safety wise, that I feel necessary to disclose before the investigation. And there are some things that we just talk about after.
right. And this is going to be a common thing too throughout this discussion of the lockhouse is like the real dangers, a lot of the real dangers weren't the ghosts. They were the people, the nature around us. And like, that was not something I was anticipating. I was like, we're just going to be out in nature having a good little time. And no,
Yeah.
there's
Um,
people, there's things you have to be afraid of that aren't ghosts.
we'll come back to that, but going back to our initial walkthrough and what Cam was saying, I think there were a lot of vibes both downstairs in the basement. I think all of us said that it wasn't it was a heavy feeling, not as in a depressed or oppressive way, but there was a lot of energy in the basement that we could all pick up on. Um, and then going upstairs, I got upstairs and immediately I said, whoa, there's something up here. I feel real dizzy, like I can feel something up here.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. Our first walkthrough, all of us initially felt something in the basement in that one room, which we'll get to what happened in that room in that basement later. But I thought it was interesting that we all felt something in that basement room the first walkthrough.
Lennon, was there anything that really stood out to you during that first initial walkthrough of the house?
Um, yes. So to give a little bit of context for the viewers at home, when it comes to an investigation, my role besides research historian, is also psychic medium. So one of the points of my practice is that I try not to do as much research specifically into any one property before I go, so I can do what's called a cold reading, and I can get an idea of just sort of what I'm dealing with. And so as we were walking through, I did feel several presences. So you have first the presence of just the land itself, right? You have just the sort of overwhelming presence of being in nature. It almost, I describe it as a feeling of like being in someone else's house when I am out in these woods specifically, because it very much is native land. And I think that remnants of that remain, and it's something to tread very carefully and cautiously on with, in my opinion, sort of a sense of reverence, because it really does feel like being in someone else's home. But inside the blockhouse itself, the first thing that I felt was a young girl. Um, I thought maybe she was around like 6 or 8, old enough to articulate herself, but not necessarily so old that she would have been, I don't know, able to vote. Not that she would have been able to anyway in that time period that she was alive, but just to get a better sense of where she existed in her age range and space. And then the other presence that I felt was that of kind of an older man. Maybe I think originally I had said something like his mid to late 40s is what I had said initially on walking into the house. And then just the basement was a lot of energy, and I wasn't sure exactly what that energy was yet because it was so sort of palpable and present. And sometimes spirits make themselves very apparent to you very early on, and sometimes you sort of have to sort through the layers of nuance and presence in order to get to the heart of what you're talking to, which I think that we did, and that was an incredible moment, but we'll get into that later.
And Paul, was there anything other than the basement that was super apparent to you on that first walkthrough?
Honestly, no. And I'm starting to realize I might not be as sensitive as I once thought I was, because I really didn't feel anything until I got into the basement. But what really got me in my heart when we were first there was that nice little campfire moment we had. That was so cute. That was so much fun.
Yeah. And actually around the campfire, my experience upstairs and in the basement, and then Lennon and I had an experience around the campfire, which I had the opposite experience of you at on this investigation, where I realized I was more sensitive than I was giving myself credit for. Um, because I think you and Cam walked down to the river, or you went to get more wood. I just remember they and I were by the campfire alone, and I for like 15 minutes I'd been looking behind my shoulder at a spot in the woods, and I said to Lennon, "Do you get something back there?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Are you seeing a Native American man? Because I am." And that was the moment when I was like, okay, I don't want to be outside anymore.
And it was right behind the closest porta potty to the lock house. So the most accessible bathroom right there. It felt very much like somebody was posted and watching and just seeing how things unfolded.
And I kind of got the sense that he wasn't antagonistic, but he definitely wasn't pleased.
Yeah.
That is something that I have felt time and time again. Again, out in this area, out in those woods, it's not our land.
Mhm.
It is not our land. And like I said, you have to come in with just a sense of reverence and a fair degree of humility, I think, as well. Bless you.
Thank you.
Simply because there were people who were here long before us, and bad things happened to them. And we are only here now enjoying the fruits of their labor because those bad things happened to them. So I can completely understand why a spirit, in his case, might not be the most welcoming to four individuals who are here specifically to poke around and stir things up. So I could understand the hesitance or the watchfulness on his part. I think that every time you go on an investigation, you learn more about yourself as an investigator and more about your investigative style. And the last 2 times that I have gone out into the woods with Cam, I have realized that's a personal boundary that I'm just not in love with. I'm just not in love with the woods at night. It's not my favorite thing.
No, there were several moments where Cam and Paul went on adventures down by the river, down the trail, and you and I were happy to sit on the stoop of the lock house, talking about not ghosts, talking about our books. We're both writers and projects of our own, and getting to know one another. And Paul, you and Cam went on adventures, and do you two want to talk about those adventures in the woods that Len and I were too scared to participate in?
Yeah, so they were actually kind of uneventful. I don't know how Cam felt, but like him and I, we walked that trail by ourselves in the darkness, and we walked down to the river a couple times by ourselves in the darkness, and they were honestly kind of eventful. Well, uneventful. What would you say, Cam?
I was kind of hoping to see something strange and nothing happened.
Right. I feel like the real like thing we heard were a lot of animals. And that was like the real because there's like wild animals there, like coyotes and maybe not coyotes, but things of that nature.
Yes,
There are coyotes.
Yeah.
there are coyotes, there are bobcats, there are bears. That's why when you go to the bathroom alone at night, you make sure you make at least a little bit of noise so that nothing, like you let the bears know of your presence before you go just walking into wherever they're about to be.
Exact back to that thing. Sometimes the real life, not real life thing, but the actual things that are there are scarier than the ghosts. Like spooky, but unfortunately the woods were kind of uneventful for Cameron and I. But I feel like if Lennon and DJ, if you guys had went out there by yourselves, you guys might have had a very different experience.
Well, your first foray, we made it 10, 15 feet down the trail with you. And I vocalized that I was no longer comfortable because I was sensing, I don't know whether it was the Native American spirit that Lennon and I had experienced earlier. I don't know if it was multiple. I don't know if it was um, forest spirits, elemental spirits, spirits of the land, however you want to describe those, um, or soldiers, but I did not feel welcome walking down that trail. And I actually felt like an imposing sense of danger if we continued. And I was very glad when you and Cam came back safe and sound, because for about 5 minutes before we could see your lights again, I just kept looking over like, they back yet?
Right, right. Well, we made it safe and sound and we went in the house. So let's discuss a little bit of what happened to us inside the house. So we started out upstairs, right? Didn't we, doing our investigation? We set up all sorts of our Project Para sensors and cat
Yeah.
toys.
Cam, before we get into like what happened or didn't happen, do you want to describe some of the equipment that you brought and what you built and go into that?
So I brought a fair bit of different gear. We had the PIR motion sensors, which are the sensors that I manufacture and sell on the Project Para. And then we had a REM pod, which has an alternating radio frequency. And essentially, as a conductive object moves into the field, it changes the capacitance, and that is measured by the REM pod. And depending on the intensity, it lights up to different levels. What else did we have? We had those cat balls, which are essentially motion sensors or vibration sensors, different from the passive infrared motion sensor, which detects a change in moving sources of infrared radiation. The cat balls, you just have to physically move them, opposed to move around them.
I do want to say that the cat balls have to be my favorite piece of investigation equipment because they are so cheap. It's so easy to get. Me and Paul got 4 from Target right before we left Pittsburgh. And it's just fabulous that we were able to go into the pet section of a Target and get them for
Get those
$10.
kinds of equipment.
Right. But we had so many sensors sensing motion and temperature and all sorts of things. So if something was happening, we were going to catch it.
Yes.
We were ready. Go
It
ahead,
was
sorry.
really overwhelming because it was so easy for us to trip the sensors. I mean, every time we kind of set up home base in the kitchen of the house, and the way it was set up, if you haven't watched the video yet, there's the front door in the middle of the house and the stairs going upstairs. To the left, looking in, is the living room, and then looking to the right is the kitchen. The kitchen was home base, but we had a sensor right in the doorway of the living room, and every time you'd walk past the kitchen door, which Paul, you did walk past that a lot, the sensor would go off, and after a while, it was like, okay, just Paul, turn off.
Right. So if something was happening, we were catching it. And unfortunately, for the first part of our investigation upstairs, we really didn't catch anything. But were we just like asking questions? Yeah.
So we were doing a lot of question asking. Um, Whenever I go into an investigation space, I usually don't start with what I deem to be the most haunted room. I usually start with maybe like a more quiet room. One, to kind of get everybody acclimated to what it is like to do a paranormal investigation, especially if you haven't really investigated paranormally before, so that everyone kind of gets like a little bit of a practice run before you go into like your more haunted sections of the house. And also because it establishes a good baseline for comparison later, so that you know what a non-haunted room versus a very presently actively haunted room is going to look like. To expand a little bit more on the sensors as well. So I believe the REM pod, which is like a cylindrical device with a little antenna up top, that tracks both temperature fluctuations and if something gets very close into its motion range. So you could tap the little cylinder or you could like run your finger along the antenna and that would make it go off. But simply standing around it wouldn't do anything. The motion sensors were triggered by something crossing directly into the line of sight of essentially like the little infrared laser. And inside the house, the only time that the motion sensors were triggered were, I think, by us. But the REM pod was going off now and again pretty consistently upstairs and downstairs, but never in the room that we were in.
Yeah. And it was mainly like the temperature changing, going off, right? That was for the temperature. No.
For those of you who haven't watched the video yet, or for those of you who want more context, I think so. We did set up a baseline in each of the rooms for starting upstairs, and we actually left the REM pod upstairs in one of the bedrooms on a table. And after like we did our initial investigation, we decided we were just gonna chill. And as we were sitting down there, the REM pod went off upstairs, and this ended up happening 4 or 5 times throughout the night, where we're sitting downstairs talking or conducting a different experiment, and it would start going off, and we would give it like a couple seconds to see if it was just like the temperature, because this is a house that was built in the late 1820s. It was completed in 1830. It is totally historically correct in that there's no central air, there's no electricity, there's no plumbing, and the this is Southern Maryland. We were in a hot spell. It was probably about 90 degrees in the house, well after dark. And so it's like, let's give it a couple seconds. Maybe it's just the temperature like evening itself out. And then we would go running upstairs. And we'd get upstairs and it would continue until we got 2 or 3 questions in, and then it would stop. And the second or third time I asked the question, I kind of got the sense it was the little girl that Lennon had sensed. And I said, like, are you like pulling a joke on us?
Very that, very that. And then going off the electrical thing, we also, so there's no electrical work in the building, right? It's like from the 1860s, there's no wiring, no nothing. And we had an EMF reader, which senses like changes in electromagnetic activity, right?
Electromagnetic frequencies.
Force,
Frequency.
electromotive force.
Okay. Can you explain that to me? What is that again?
So if when you have current flowing through a wire,
Mhm,
an electromagnetic field is generated around that wire,
mhm.
and the EMF sensor can pick that up, and things like radio waves can
Yeah.
also trigger the EMF sensor.
Okay, okay.
So that's why your phone, if it's close to your phone, all of the data coming from and leaving your phone can set off the EMF sensor.
Now, a couple other words of general disclaimer. Sometimes telephone wires, not, like just your cell phone, but actual wires that connect landlines together can set it off. But the
Mhm,
closest landline to us was probably at least a mile away
mhm,
because, again, we're out in nature. There's no landlines, there's no electrical wiring. The only electrical current that was not something that we brought into the house was a solar panel on the side of the roof that led to two floodlights to illuminate the front and the back of the house. And even those were not very strong floodlights. And probably can correct me if I'm wrong, but not capable of setting off the EMF reader.
Definitely not.
Actually, we got the most activity on that on the first floor of the house, on the opposite side from where that solar panel was. Um, I will say that probably the closest electrical source was across the river at the Trump golf course, which I did take the opportunity of flipping off as we watched the sunset.
was
Not to make this
beautiful.
political, but
God bless America.
so moving from
Things that make me patriotic. Sorry.
moving from the downstairs or from the upstairs, let's head to the first floor. I think our next hotspot was we went into the living room and we began talking to the older gentleman. And in the living room, we didn't get a whole lot. We did, Cam did have a um, something like an Ovilus on his phone, and Lennon, you went under for the Estes method. And it started out really strong where it was amazing because you were under, so you didn't hear this. But at one point, the Ovilus like app said 58. And not even 2 minutes later, you said from listening to Spirit Box, I am 58.
Yeah,
And
that was an interesting moment for
we
sure.
said, are you 58? And you said close. But then it really became conflicting where the spirit box kept telling us we were in danger, we had to leave, if you were just telling us biographical information. At which point we did calm down. Scaredy cat, newbie here, was like, I want to go in the kitchen and I want to drink some wine and just chill out. But that's when we got our first like big experience of the night with the EMF reader.
We were getting some pretty wild EMF spikes in the kitchen, and it seemed
Um,
to like be
yeah.
answering our questions.
Oh, you're at the center of that. Like, if you want to discuss that, and Lennon and Cam, jump in with your sensitive and historical perspective and your technical perspective as Paul describes that.
Well, the EMF started spiking in the kitchen, and we were like started asking it questions like, can you like see when an EMF spikes, it lights completely up to know, like, let you know what's going off. And we would like ask it, like, can you like step away, make it not light up, and then light up again. And then like that's how you get it to answer questions, right? So make it light up for yes and not light up for no. And we were getting some answers, right? Isn't that where we found out like the person was like 48 or 58? Am I wrong about that? Or
We did get confirmation that he was 58 because we went back from the obvious like app, the SS method, and we asked, are you 58? And we did get a yes. We got a time period in which he lived around there, which was the 1830s to 40s. He lived there for about 3 years. And I think it was most clear that it was the end of the 30s into the 40s. And another thing that was said on the Ovulus was we got the names Joseph and Johnson. It did confirm the name Joseph, but not the name Johnson. And so I think it was, we all began referring to that spirit as Joseph simply because we had um, two or three, because Lennon, you may have said Joseph during the Estes method as well. We got to look back at that tape.
I don't I don't think I did.
Okay.
Um, I don't remember hearing any names.
Okay.
The Estes method, for those of you following along at home, is a sensory deprivation period where essentially you're blindfolded, so you can't see what's going on, and then you have noise canceling headphones over your ears, and it basically plays radio static at you. Now, um, being a psychic medium, my best sense is actually hearing for me. Like instead of I see dead people, it's I hear dead people. And so I was a little bit surprised by the Estes method because this was my first time actually trying it. And I was a little bit surprised because I found it, I guess, more limiting. But at the same time, mediumship is also heavily dependent sometimes on psychology. And so it's really hard to ascertain what's just like a thought that's in your head versus like what's a true psychic inference, which is why we cross-reference to find those sort of like points of convergence. Now, I will say the Lock House 25 was built in 1831, so the 30s to the 40s being a very important time period for the lock houses make a lot of sense, right? If something had been like, I was from the 1820s, I would have been like, that's not true. Unless it happened to be just like a land spirit. But for someone living in a lock house, I would expect it not to be earlier than the 1820s and not to be later than the 1920s, which is when the lock house closed down.
And I will say that you, as a psychic medium, probably would find the Estes method more limiting, because I think it's used mostly by investigators who are not sensitive or mediums or psychics, at least in any real measurable way. Um, and so I think that it's a way for spirits to manipulate the radio frequencies to pull out certain words and use the energy. So I can definitely get why it wasn't for you. And honestly, I love the Estes method, and I was so excited to do it on this investigation, but it was a little disappointing because we didn't really get any good results. Any of the We tried it 4 times, because you
And
did it.
throughout different
Yes.
and throughout different points of the night. So it wasn't just one sitting, it was multiple sessions in multiple places within the house, across like hours spanned between sessions that we did.
Yes. But it just didn't work in this setting. But I it could be because we did have a plethora of other mediums, excuse the pun, for the spirits to come through. But yeah, I think Joseph and the EMF, and we found that he really just enjoyed playing with the lights, to the point where he very clearly said, I found during this that when it came to a point where we were no longer getting intelligent responses, it was very helpful to say, are you done answering questions? If you are, can you, like, okay, can you please confirm that? Like asking twice to make sure. And we just sat there in the kitchen, and we sat it on a chair. Nothing was near it, no lanterns, no phones, and it just kept going off. And We even said like, okay, like Joseph, can you take it down to green? We have a question. Do you want us to just leave this here for you? And it just like went off the charts again. Um, he just enjoyed playing with it.
Now, Cam, do you have anything to add to the EMF thing? Do you have any thoughts, theories? Do you think it was fully paranormal? What do you think?
I am not a fan of the EMF sensor. I think it is very subject to external influences.
Hmm. So there could have been a lot of out because, like you said, the cell phone thing, and we did have our cell phones in our pocket, and I did notice like sometimes when I would move my cell phone closer to it, it would light up. So I will say that is a factor that played it, but also like the intelligent responses were interesting as well. So it was very interesting.
I
So
just don't think it can be used to confirm anything.
right, right.
I
Yeah.
think that I think that in all paranormal experiences, you have to look at the totality of evidence because you might have what feels to be a significant experience that is later debunked. Um, I think that we talked a little bit about this in the basement the first time, but my approach, and I think Cam shares this approach as well, is like a logic first approach. So when something paranormal starts happening, the first thing in your mind as a paranormal investigator that you might like to do is say, okay, how can I explain this rationally? Because something that is not easily explainable is even more convincing evidence that a paranormal occurrence did truly happen. Um, when it comes to the EMF, I wouldn't discount that outright because we were getting what seemed to be intelligent responses. And so we can take a look again at the totality of the evidence and look at those ley lines of coincidences between that and the Estes method and like the ghost tube as well. I will say with the ghost tube, one of the things that I was wondering if it is that there were any sort of preloaded phrases on the app because it's possible that it might have just been spitting things out while we weren't getting genuine responses to make sure that you kept the app downloaded because that's how an application makes money. Yeah.
Yeah, phone apps for ghost hunting can be a little spooky and not in like a good kind of spooky.
Dude,
Like in the I can scare you way.
yeah.
Hmm.
And it did. The Ghost Tube app did start out really, really promising. And I will say that between the fact that it gave us Joseph and 58 before it gave us the danger, leave, get out, I can scare you. And then the Estes method, you said 58 close. You gave a little more biographical information, and then going into the EMF, where we were able to confirm some of that totality. I do believe there was an older gentleman named Joseph speaking to us, at least through one of those methods, and then going down to the basement, that rational first approach, which where that's where you first talked about it. It's very easy. We all said we felt a very I'm trying to think. I keep wanting to say heavy, but that makes it seem like it was a negative energy. It was just a very full energy. I think that's a better, more neutral way to say it. Um, but looking at that rational first, like basements are creepy. This is an old house. It's very easy to say like, oh, the basement like creepy. There's a demon down there. But I think this gives us a perfect opportunity to go into our experiences down in the basement.
Can I actually quickly debunk your logical rebuttal?
Yes,
Sure.
go for it.
So when it comes to a basement, yes, it's spooky. Yes, it's a little like creepy. You might be scared to go down into the dark. But typically, when you feel a very present sort of energy, it could be a temperature fluctuation. Sometimes heat will do it. So heat rises if you walk into like an upstairs in a stuffy old house. and it feels really hot and oppressive, that could do it. Or if you're in like a basement where it's dark and cold and musty, sometimes mold spores can give you that oppressive feeling. Um, but I don't know about you guys, when DJ said it wasn't dirty, it wasn't dirty. Yes, there were cobwebs, there were spiders, but there wasn't mold, there wasn't mildew. And that's one of the things that, oh, Cam, did you have something to add?
It smelled kind of mildewy to me.
It did smell mildewy to you?
Yeah.
I it a little bit in comparison to the rest of the house, but it also was a little more open. Had it had screening, and then it had more secure wooden shutters. And even the doors were like that, so it was less closed off from the outside. So I do think there was that more opportunity for that mildewy, a little more of a unfinished basementy smell to it. Um, but yeah, but just thinking about it rationally, like it's very easy first time basement. Oh yeah, I feel something, but it's a basement. But then we had a great experience with the REM pod down there, which is just like, okay, maybe I think, I don't know about the rest of you. I do think that we had a great spiritual conversation with the spirit down there.
I think that might
Twice.
have been the most bizarre paranormal thing I've ever seen.
That was crazy. Like the whole, like that's definitely the grand finale of the Poolsville house. It was that REM pod experience. If one of you guys want to like explain exactly what happened down there, because that was crazy. Like,
Well, you guys started.
Yeah.
So at that point in the night, I hadn't slept very well the night before, so I was taking a little nappy nap, like gearing up for what I thought was going to be highlight of the night, which is usually 3 a.m. That's usually when activity really spikes. But I think for us it was around like 2:30. But I was taking a little nappy nap and you guys were downstairs. So maybe talk a little bit about, how that ramped up because I missed the first half.
Um, I want to take us back to our first after dark, going down the basement where we did Poen under the Estes method. And Lennon, you were leading, asking questions, and I think I was filming and Cam was beside me. And we weren't really getting anything on the Estes method, but Cam and I both heard something outside. And Cam
I
actually
forgot about
shined
that.
his light over the door and yelled hello.
I
And
forgot about that.
and Cam, I don't know about you, but it sounded like whatever it was actually like leapt at the door when you said hello.
You guys were spooked after
We were
that.
very spooked. We
Like
had,
that.
I think that was like our first break of the night.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about that. And
Yeah,
then
that was and we'll definitely circle back to that experience later. But second, we did decide that we were going to take the REM pod downstairs. It was Paul, Cam, myself. I went under duress. I did not want to go back in the basement, but even more than not wanting to go to the basement, I didn't want to be left alone. Um, and we went down there with the REM pod, and immediately the pod began to go give us um, lighting up and noises that it hadn't given us all night. And then once we sort of set like a okay, like green is no, light up the rest of the lights for yes, we were getting really clear, intelligent answers. We are asking, is this a woman down here? Um, and just some basic questions. And halfway through that, Lennon, who was upstairs, what
Alone.
happened to you?
alone.
Alone, yeah.
So, I was feeling pretty safe in the house, right? I was feeling like pretty calm. I wasn't too worried about anything in the house. I don't know what's another question. But so I was taking my little nappy nap and all of a sudden I felt like something came up to me, and I was on an air mattress, right? And I felt like something came up to the right side of the bed and put a hand on the bed and just gave it like a little push. Or it almost felt like somebody had walked by and like kicked it a little bit. And had the three of you been upstairs, I would have assumed it was just one of you guys moving around. But at that point, I knew I was alone. And so I was sort of just kind of half awake, half asleep, listening to what was going on downstairs because I could hear the questions being asked and I could hear the REM pod going off. And then all of a sudden, like I said, it was a very distinctive, jarring motion. It didn't scare me, like I wasn't afraid, but that was the first time that I had been physically interacted with on this hunt. And in terms of investigations, I will say this was one of the more quiet ones. But that like REM pod experience is typically what I look for in order to say, like, yeah, this was a successful investigation. So I kind of set up and I was like, guys, something just touched me. And Paul, I think it was you who said, like, come downstairs. And
Probably.
Yeah,
so,
we all yelled like, "Come downstairs! Like we're getting something." Um, and you came down, and we began asking questions. We got that it was a woman. That she did not live in the lock house itself. She was actually attached to the general store, Jarbo's store, which is right next door. It is the ruins of a general store. Um, that she that her father and her brother both fought in the Civil War. They were on the Union side. Lennon, you intuited that she was African American. Um, we did confirm through the use of the REM pod that she had a relative named Basil. How do you pronounce
Basil
it?
Newman.
Basil Newman. Um, and I think the most miraculous moment was when you asked, did the Underground Railroad come through here? Yes. Did it go through the store where you worked? Yes. Were you and your family a station? Yes. Did anyone ever know? No. And it's like, we knew there was a station here and we're getting so close to like revealing you're part of it. And immediately at that point, I could tell that this woman, like, first of all, the feeling in the basement just became so happy. And the REM pod, it was like she was dancing around it the way the lights were going and the buzzer was going off. And we really couldn't get her to settle down to answer any more questions. Like, she was just so excited. Um, and just that feeling of happiness. Like you could feel the joy. It was palpable in the room.
So, to give a little bit more context into all of this, Basil Newman was a freed Black ferry captain who was operating a ferry across Edwards Ferry. He was stationed in Loudon, right across the river, actually. And we know that he was a stop on the Underground Railroad because somebody in Virginia, in a memoir called The Cause We Lost and the Land We Loved, pointed a finger at him and said that he was helping criminals escape the river, escape across the river, and was very upset at the institution of the Underground Railroad. And that is one of the most cohesive pieces of evidence that we have that points to Edwards Ferry being on the Underground Railroad. Now, Basil Newman passed away in 1855, so 10 years before the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. But he was a freed man, and so he owned property, and he was a ferry boat captain, and his family did fight on the Union side in the Civil War 10 years later. So these are all verifiable historical facts. Now, the things that led me to believe that she was an African American woman, besides, psychic intuition, was because when we asked when she was born specifically, um, the REM pod was sort of like wishy-washy about it. And record keeping back in the day was not what it is today, especially for the Black community. Not to say that there weren't records that existed, but the probability was a lot higher if you didn't know when your birthday was, that you were of the African American community. So that was the first thing. The other thing was that her family was indicated as fighting on behalf of the Union. Now, this area of Maryland was deeply, deeply Confederate sympathizing. I have been to like repatriation talks where they talk about this being hallowed ground for the Confederacy. And so when we talk about repatriation, it's, repatriating land that was stolen away from the enslaved people who built this community and also from the Native Americans who weren't able to make their homes here after the 1700s. Um, and so the facts started to align with the historical research that I had done. And I happened to be aware of Basil Newman because I personally, 200 years after the fact, am a big fan of being able to say somebody's name, right? Like with the Underground Railroad specifically, we know about Harriet Tubman, because she was one of the most prolific people along the Underground Railroad getting people to safety. But we don't know every stop. We don't know every house. We don't know every family who put their life on the line to make sure that other people had the same freedoms and rights that they enjoyed. And so to be able to come back and look at this family, look at these people and say, look at how much bravery and self-sacrifice that they had. Look at everything that they fought for and everything that they did. And we haven't forgotten it all this time later. And so that was, like you said, just a miraculous moment. It was truly very heartwarming.
And after that, everything went quiet for the night, except for what I think was the most terrifying
Oh
part of the night.
God.
Paul, Cameron, do you want to give context to how that sensor ended up outside in front of you? Because that scared the living bejesus out of all of us.
That was pretty crazy. Because Cameron and I went on our one of our little walks out in nature to see if we could find anything crazy. And we took some sensors with us, and Cam actually sent one of the sensors up like right outside the house. And so we set it up out there and we forgot it and came back inside. And we're sitting in the house and it starts going off. We hear the sensor going off outside and we're like, at first, okay, maybe it's just an animal.
I do have a funny antidote before that. So you came running inside because you heard something and you left it out there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then a while later, like we were sitting in the kitchen, we could hear it going off occasionally. And then at one point, Poe, you just walked to the front door, ripped it open, and yelled, "Hello," outside. And me and Leonard are like, "What are you doing?" And you're like, "I heard someone." And Leonard goes, "There are crackheads out there, and I've never seen somebody slam a door." And you're like, "How do I lock it? How do I lock it?" And that was the moment when I realized in our friendship, you are the golden retriever and I am the black cat, because you're just like, "Hello." But yeah, for the rest of the night, that sensor went off randomly. Um,
But
and
consistently.
Very consistent.
consistently. And you left it in front of the house, sort of on the, if you're looking at the lock house, it would have been under the left side window, like across the towpath, I think.
Yeah.
outside the living room window, um, which was terrifying because it was so hot in there. We can say this because we're not staying there anymore. We had opened the windows and put the screens in, and the only thing separating us from the outside were the wooden shutters, the windows, and these little screens that literally pop in and out. And that was the room we chose to sleep in. And we're all laying there because once we didn't really get anything more, we had all laid down in our various sleeping arrangements, and we're laying there, and it's at this point it's like 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was like every minute and a half to 2 minutes it would go off, and somebody said, like, do we think it's a spirit or a person or a raccoon? And I'm laying on my sleeping bag and I went, it's a raccoon. And I forget, I don't know who said, you think? And I said, I know, because that's the only way I'm going to be able to sleep.
That thing really lasts for hours.
And then I didn't go to sleep right away because I have insomnia and sleeping troubles. So I think I was up for a good hour and a half after the rest of you. And I'm laying there and it's like 6:30 in the morning. And you're all asleep, and I'm laying there and I'm listening to it go beep 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 beep. And honestly, it sounded as if somebody was pacing. And we
So
had tried.
Cam,
Mhm.
sorry, I was just gonna ask if like maybe we could get a little bit more science into how these motion sensors work and
Yes,
what
please.
could have been setting it off if not a spirit.
Absolutely. Uh, I've got some of the sensors right here. You have this thing on the end called a Fresnel lens, and as anything above 0 degrees Kelvin essentially is emitting infrared radiation, and that can be picked up by the sensor. And if you just have it, you have two different pyroelectric crystals in here. And if, say, you didn't have this on, these are going to let me start with what the pyroelectric crystal is. Essentially, when it's hit with infrared radiation, it generates a small voltage. So if you have a thermal source over here and no Fresnel lens on it, um, the amount of current uh, being generated by both of the pyroelectric crystals is going to be roughly the same. Now you throw the lens on top and imagine you have some thermally emitting source walking by. It's going to apply an uneven distribution of infrared light onto the two pyroelectric crystals. So this device senses that difference, pulls high. That's read by the chip inside, and then it flashes and beeps.
So anything that gives off heat, basically.
It's moving.
Oh
Two
my.
things. A, I could have gone the rest of my life without having to hear that noise again. After how many times I had to be the only person awake and hear it. And second of all, for the the people who had to ask what viscosity was early in the evening, and people like them, how many degrees Fahrenheit is 0 degrees Kelvin?
uh, I want to say minus 200 something. It's absolute zero. So that's when all atomic motion completely ceases.
So what do you think was outside? What do you think might have been setting it off, Cam?
It could have been an animal, could have been a person, or potentially even something paranormal.
Oh, geez. It's just so spooky to think about something just walking back and forth repeatedly across that sensor.
I Now that we're out of the situation, and I think we can all go through and give our opinions, I do think it was something paranormal. I don't think a person at that time of night would pace back and forth in front of the sensor. I
Crack
think it
makes you do crazy things.
Crack will make you do crazy things.
I think that if had it been a person, so all right, I will say that addiction and unhousedness is like not a joke. And along the C&O Canal, there are a lot of places to squat. There are a lot of places that you could potentially like break into just to have a place to sleep for the night. And so it is not unheard of for lock houses or even residences just along the towpath to be inhabited by squatters. And typically, these squatters do have a drug addiction or a mental health issue. And within the last 2 years, it has led to a fatality. And so this was sort of top of my mind when you start saying that, like, hearing human voices in the woods. I'm like, don't talk to them. Don't talk to them.
Mhm.
Simply because it could escalate very quickly into an unsafe situation for all involved. That being said, if it were a person, I don't think it would have gone off consistently for hours on end, nor do I think that it would have escaped our notice because let's not forget that we were all woken up by a voice in the morning and somebody trying the lock house door. Because as soon as sunrise hits, there's bikers, there's people walking along the towpath for their morning exercise. So we heard firsthand what it sounds like when somebody is right outside the lock. And they even came up and tried the door handle. That was not our experience the night before. So we would have heard if there were a person, a living person, that close to the lock house. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't an animal, but I can't imagine a wild animal being so close to be able to trip the sensor repeatedly for hours on end and not get scared and scamper off by the light and the sound. Because I don't know about you guys, but that does not seem very plausible to me.
Another thing, piggybacking off of that, is with the person who did try the door. Um, and for those of you scared, it was definitely, we heard them say like, "Oh, I've stayed here before," and they were definitely just trying to like whoever they were just show them the house. It was not malicious.
Which is
Um,
crazy in general. Like, girl, like, what were they doing?
yeah, like you know, like this is a place where people can stay. Why would you just assume it was open? But also that path was gravel, and there were several times in the morning after the sun did come up where I could hear through the windows people walking the path, people biking the path because it was gravel, and gravel does, it has a certain noise. And we did have the windows open, so there was no noise pollution or no barrier to distort or block out that noise of the gravel. So even though I told myself rather unconvincingly that it was a raccoon, I do think it was something. And just the fact that it was just beyond the boundary of the house where we had left it, and that it was pacing really makes me think it was something that was curious but could not approach any closer. Paul?
I completely agree. And one thing that did happen before we got like completely freaked out and we heard it go off the first time, Cam and I were going to go out and investigate and get the sensor back. And when we opened the door, we actually did see the sensor, like the light from the sensor go off and no one was there. So that, I don't know if you remember that. Do you remember doing that, Cam? Did you actually see the light go off also?
Yes.
And no one was there. So like we actually saw the sensor going off with no one there. So there is a very real possibility that there could have been a spooky like ghost outside, like
Just
something paranormal.
just to roll everything out, Cam, what is the range on the sensor? I know we had one in the living room and it could pick up Paul in the kitchen, but that was at most 7 feet. How far does this thing read?
It depends on the intensity of the thermally emitting source.
So it
So
could have like sensed us opening the door or no?
Oh, it was facing the opposite direction.
That's true. That's true.
oh shit, I didn't know that. I thought it was like pointing up or down the towpath. The fact that it was pointing across the canal to a construction site that was empty in woods. Oh shit.
There's something going on there.
I don't
And
think it was picking up raccoons. And like the way that it was pointing in between it and the next section of land was the canal. So nothing could stand in front of it past maybe 2 or 3 feet. But like, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't we find it in a different position in the morning?
Oh
yeah,
yeah, it was like 45 degrees offset from where I placed it.
Oh, there's something spooky going on there.
It
Uh,
also had a little bit of mud on the edge of it.
so like it was moving around a bit.
I don't know what put the mud there. Maybe an animal hit
Hmm.
it and left some print or something.
And again, it's entirely possible that at least one occurrence out of, I don't know, over 4 hours, 100 occurrences, that it was an animal. But again, it's the totality of evidence. If it had gone off once or twice in the night, because remember, inside, not a peep, not a whisper, except when we walked in front of it. But outside, to go off that consistently towards a space where nothing exists, I just think it's really interesting. Cam, could a bug have tricked it if it were like a large moth? Could that have done anything?
I suppose, yeah.
Hmm. Maybe a moth crawling back and forth on it for hours, which I
For
highly
4 hours.
right. No. So I guess those were the two main experiences, what happened to us in the basement and what happened outside. And honestly, I want to note with the REM pod too, the REM pod didn't act up anywhere else in the house like it did in the basement. The basement was the only room where we got that many lights and that much consistency to our questions.
And out of the 3 times that we brought the REM pod to the basement, it only went off for 2 out of those 3 times. Because the third time that we brought it down there, not a hint, not a whisper, not a peep. And so, again, when we talk about like evidence for a successful investigation, if I had brought the REM pod down there and 3 out of 3 times it reacted a crazy amount, I would be like, all right, well, like maybe there's an electrical signal interfering with this, but the fact that it was quiet in every other room in the house and then only loud 2 out of the 3 times that we were in the basement, that to me says this is not an external force that is making this REM pod go off. So that is even more convincing to me that it might have been something paranormal.
I completely agree that it was insane. I don't know. I don't even, it honestly doesn't feel real. I don't know if you guys experienced this like after paranormal investigation, but like I'm questioning like myself, like, did I actually experience that? Was like that actually a real thing that happened to me? Do you guys like experience this too or no?
Yeah, it was it's very hard for me to accept what happened with the REM pod.
Because like there's a very real possibility we were talking to a spirit, which is like in crazy. It's
I will,
wild
I
to
will
like
say
comprehend.
I said this to Paul as we were getting back to Pittsburgh, and we were discussing like the how unbelievable it was that we had this experience. And I said, even in the moment, like what, like in the moment with the REM pod in the basement, I almost had an out of body experience where like I was like, this can't be happening. I feel like I'm watching this in on Ghost Adventures or watching a Sam and Colby video. Like it
Right.
was, and I was talking about this with my therapist. I was giving her a recap in our last session, and I was just talking about the evidence, and she corroborated this, that the human mind, if it is unable to process something, it will convince us that it is not happening, that it's not real. And I think that was a moment where it was just such a incredible moment of unexplainableness, high strangeness, to borrow a term from John Keel, that the only way that my brain could react was, you're not in this moment. You're watching it on YouTube. You're sitting on Paul's couch and you've had one too many Swifties.
I will say, when it comes to paranormal experiences, that REM pod moment, anything less than something like that to me is less convincing of like a true paranormal experience. I tend to feel the most comfortable with more definable experiences as well. Like seeing the REM pod go off like that, to me, I'm like, ah, yes, very good. And I think that like I might have a slightly different perspective on this because I talk to dead people.
Hmm.
So to me, seeing the REM pod go off is a little bit affirming because I'm like, the experiences that I have, I'm not crazy, you know? I like to think of myself as a person fairly rooted in reality. And when I have experiences like that, when I see it live in front of me and everybody else can see it too, and it's not just me saying it, that makes me feel a lot better about paranormal investigations because I'm like, see, I knew.
It,
It is
the REM
happening.
Going off what you said, Lennon, the experience with the REM pod, it was like, oh my gosh, wow. And then also that moment when I turned to you and said, do you see the have you seen the Native American? Because like I've had sensitive moments in the past, and we had this discussion about my journey through psychic phenomenon and sensitivity. But like in that moment, like it's so easy, first investigation and knowing a little bit of the history, to just like look in the woods and be like, there's a Native American. But like to be with someone who is a medium, who is confident in their um sorry, I lost the word, abilities, thank you. And to be like, okay, like this spot right here, are you seeing what I'm seeing? That was really affirming too.
Hmm.
I'm
Hmm.
glad that we had that moment together. Honestly, there are some things in the course of an investigation that I choose for whatever reason not to really acknowledge or talk about. So seeing that spirit was something that I kind of clocked, but I was like, we're gonna leave that alone. You know, like we're gonna like live and let live, especially throughout the night as we were kind of getting like some scary messages or being like warned specifically that he was gonna get us. You know, it was one of those things where I was like, I could feed into this, but feeding into it gives it power. And sometimes the most like responsible thing, in my opinion, is just to like pretend it's not there. You know, like when you're a kid and you get freaked out and you pull the blankets over your head, it doesn't do anything. You know, you're no less susceptible to monsters, but it makes you feel better. And sometimes when you notice a situation where you're not necessarily ready to handle it or comfortable handling it or even want to engage, the best thing to do is just sort of put up that wall. Um, I tell the story sometimes of the City of the Dead tour under Edinburgh. There are vaults that run all underneath of the city of Edinburgh in Scotland. My friend and I went down there on a tour one time because what do creepy people do in creepy cities? We go to the creepiest places. And we were warned about a spirit. I already had seen him from the moment I walked in. We were clocking each other, but I was basically just like, out of sight, out of mind, I'll get there when I get there. Now, at one point, he was so palpably beside me, and this is the spirit that like people say makes you pass out. And they're like, if you feel hot, it's, you know, dangerous. And I'm feeling like white hot. I'm feeling like it's suddenly hard to breathe. All of these things are happening. And I had to remind myself that I have personal sovereignty. I am the living person in the situation. I am safe. It cannot hurt me any place outside of my mind and my imagination. However, the person who was guiding the tour was like looking around at the little semicircle and we're in the corner, right? So like there's nothing between me but this like, spirit that's in my face and the wall. So I've got nowhere to go. I've got nowhere to like run to basically. She turns over, she looks with her little flashlight, does a double take, and then interrupts the tour to ask me and my friend a question to make sure that we can like respond verbally and we're not about to pass out. But sometimes when you feel a presence that is, the point of the story, sometimes when you feel a presence that is not necessarily welcoming to you and could lead to an altercation later, the best thing to do is not acknowledge, not engage, not feed in. And so that was my strategy with the man in the bushes, because at the end of the day, spirits are people too, you know? Like my opinion is that they're people who have passed over. And so I didn't want to amp him up either because to him, we are strangers on his land. And that can't be like a fun place for him to be either. So just letting it go and letting him stand sentinel and doing his thing, best case for every scenario.
And that is exactly why I did not want to be outside and why I did not particularly want Paul, you, and Cam going outside, because I knew he was not too happy with us being out there. Um,
But we're just brave boys and we went for it.
yes, you're my bravest boys. And that's our experience. And I think to wrap it up, maybe each of us go through and say either what our favorite part was, one big takeaway from this.
Or whatever you want to say, just to wrap it up.
Yeah, just
Is it haunted? What do you guys think?
I'd say yes. I'd say
Yeah,
yes, haunted. I'd say very yes, haunted. And in
very.
a good way, in my opinion. I thought everybody there was real cool, even the people who weren't so jazzed about us being there. So I think that was a very successful and happy making investigation.
Period.
Cam.
That REM pod thing downstairs.
Yeah.
Crazy.
I will say in terms of like first investigation, and me and Paul did do a little research, A, into the history, B, into other experiences that people had had there. Um, and honestly, in some of the other research, like never in any of the research was there like a plethora, a Bobby Mackey's or level or a Edinburgh Vaults level experience. But this being our first real investigation, I was totally cool to go in there and like have the barest minimal, like a creek that we couldn't explain and consider it excess, and the REM pod alone. Not to mention, I do think that the EMF reader, in my opinion, was a really cool experience. Our experiences with the Ovulus in the living room, and even the little, what I think was the little girl playing pranks with the REM pod upstairs. I think in with my bar being set so low, this was an off the charts first experience for me at least. Paul?
I completely agree. This was an amazing first investigation for Crips and Quirks. And make sure, I know we've been talking about this REM pod the entire episode, so make sure and go check out our YouTube videos so you can see visually exactly what we're talking about, because we had some crazy experiences and you have to see it visually. So hop on over to the YouTube to check out that video.
And so with that, I think that's all she wrote. So
Final plugs. What do you
Len,
guys,
we'll start with you. Plug your social media, plug your projects.
what's going on?
Oh, me?
We'll start with Len and then we'll do you next.
Oh, okay. So you can follow our book project at Mysteries and Legends of the Ag Reserve on Facebook. Facebook tends to be really popular with some of the older folks who also happen to have the stories that we're looking for. So that's why it is our primary social media. You can also get in touch with us at MLAR contact us at gmail.com. So both my co-author and I are on that not investigation, on that email alias. If you would like to talk to either of us about some of our experiences, or if you yourself have a story to share.
And Cam,
If you want to go pick up a Project Para PIR sensor, go to theprojectpara.com, Para. If you just type in Project Para, nothing's going to come up because my SEO is terrible. It's $35.
it's a work in progress.
It has
Highly recommend.
Yes, it was. I mean, all the equipment that Cam brought was amazing. I thought like this being fairly low key that we were gonna like come in with our little Amazon EMF reader and our Amazon Spirit box and my Target's faux satin sleep mask blindfold, and our cat toys and like whatever you brought. And I thought it was gonna be very similar, maybe a little higher tech, but like you really brought the full bag of tricks.
He did. He blew it out of
So
the water.
so thank you, Cam, for bringing that. And Lennon, thank you
Of
for
course.
coming with all of your research, with your abilities, and to both of you for inviting us along for this experience. It was amazing, and we're so grateful to get to do it with you. And hopefully we can make this like an annual thing where like we all team up for an investigation once a year.
We'd love
Uh,
to do it again for sure. And I
yes.
just want to note really quick that Cam's sensors he's selling, they have a cute little ghost on them that lights up. It is awesome. If you're trying to go like ghost hunting, get you this sensor. Go to projectpara.com and well, the Project Para.
Yeah.
And,
Theprojectpara.com. Get yourself one of those sensors and pick up Lennon's book when it comes out.
and
Learn
the
all about the
presentation. Oh,
history.
sorry.
Get up in
The
the
presentation of Cam Sensors is immaculate. Uh, as somebody who has worked in high-end retail and packaging is like part of the product, it's amazing. Lennon, once your book comes out and I see the cover art and like how it's bound, I will hype that up too. But because as a writer, I understand it's still in the manuscript stage. So
I can send you the cover art. I drew it myself. It's
please do.
done.
Please
We're
I
do.
can
getting
send it to
And
you.
insider.
like if you need a beta reader, I'm here.
And we'll link everything down below too. So you
Yes.
can, we'll put the links to their stuff down below, their
Yes.
contacts and websites and
Um,
everything. Don't worry, it's all down below. Just give it a click.
And please, everyone, all of our corkies out there, if you have personal stories or story suggestions, or if you would like to give us feedback, or if you have stories you would like us to pass on to Lennon, or if you can't remember theprojectpara.com, email us at cripsandcorks@gmail.com. You can also follow us on both Facebook and on Twitter at Crips and Corks, or on Instagram or TikTok at Crips and Corks Pod. Paul, where can they find you when you're not on the pod?
You can find me at my personal Instagram at Paul Ember, Paulember, or my personal TikTok at Paul Ember, Paulember. And as usual, it's not delivery, it's DiGiorno.
And if you'd like to follow me, you can do so on Instagram or TikTok at therealdhpowers.com. If you would like to write me a love letter, you can address it to Lockhouse 25, Edwards Ferry, Maryland. Or if you want to send some hate mail to Donald Trump, send it to the Trump golf course right across the river in Virginia. But yes, Lennon, Cam, thank you so much again for having us on this experience, for experiencing it with us or letting us experience it with you, and for coming back on to talk about this with us as a companion piece to our video of the investigation that we did. And any final thoughts from anyone?
Thank you guys so much. That was a ton of fun.
Yes. And
Thank you guys. True professionals in every sense of the word, and I could not have asked for a better ghost hunting team.
and
Thank
many more ghost adventures. Hopefully that term's not copyrighted because of the show. All right, DJ, you want to sign us out?
All right, Corkies. Remember, keep your crips tight.
And your corks loose. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you
I
guys.
do have one correction. I checked
Yeah.
my notes about the C&O Canal.
Okay.
So the C&O Canal stands for the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which is a little bit of a misnomer because it doesn't actually go all the way to Ohio. In fact, it spans 185 miles from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, Maryland, and in that distance, there are 74 locks. And most of them still have lock houses attached to them as well, or the foundations of such.
Wow. That's so many lock houses. I can't even count that high anymore. Not after the incident.
The incident.